ready to introduce yourself. Shall we do another round since it's a new group of students?
Sure.
Who's in the room?
Yeah,
When they come up?
Yeah.
Do you want to?
yeah, please come on up.
But I don't know all of this, right?
Yes, I know, right? I warned them they might all be in this room, so I think
Yeah.
they're happy that it's half and half.
Good. Well, I know you were, I think you were next door anyway, but since we're all here in person, we'll do a quick round of new introductions. I am David Durfee. I represent the towns of Shaftesbury, Sunderland, and Glastonbury down in Bennington County. Why don't we go around this way?
I'm Leland Morgan. I represent Grand Isle County and the western portion of the town of Milton where I live.
Jed Lipsky, represent Lamoille 1 District, Stowe.
Richard Nelson, Orleans 1, Derby, and class of 85 and HER.
I'm Michelle Blaslin. I represent Wyndham 3, which is Northern Wyndham County, Rockingham, Westminster, and Brookline.
Greg Bird, Canville Peachin, graduate from UVM 2008.
John O'Brien, I represent Windsor Orange 1, so it's Royalton and Windsor and Tunbridge and Orange County.
So we'll turn it over to you, and just warning that door could open at any time. Yeah, people are usually, because it's glass, they can see, but just, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for your time. My colleagues and I are going to be presenting some research on a topic that we know has been top of mind for all of you. It's in addition to other legislative bodies in the region. And I do have a cold, so if you can't hear me through the mask, just let me know. Yeah, so we're going to be talking about the balancing the balance between agricultural land conservation and affordable housing development, specifically in Vermont. And then we're going to jump into a couple other case studies. I am Jennifer Morgan Davey.
I'm Brighton Moeller.
Alexis Yamashita.
And Kevin Haggerty.
All right.
Help me. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you. So following a high-level framing, we are going to present an overview of the current state of these issues in Vermont, and then we're going to dive into the legislative mechanisms which have been designed to address them, both current and proposed. We will then be presenting case studies from 2 other states in the region which are encountering similar issues, namely Maine and New York. And we're going to highlight some key approaches that are employed by those states to address the tensions between affordable housing development and farmland conservation. Our objective is to provide a comparative framing of similar jurisdictions with the aim of offering insights for this body's consideration as they continue to grapple with this topic. The presentation will largely parallel the brief that we have provided, and you can find more information within that. All right, thank you. So to kick off the discussion, we feel it's important to call out the ways that farmland conservation and affordable housing development have often been presented in the past, which is to say, as competing priorities promoted by distinct groups whose interests are opposed to each other. While tension certainly exists between them, we posit that rather than operating within a framework of ag land conservation versus affordable housing development, it is actually more accurate and constructive to consider them in tandem, not through the lens of versus, but through and. Environmental and economic forces, including the COVID pandemic and the 2023 and 2024 floods, have acted on both priorities in similar ways. And recent legislation has begun to reflect that reality. So throughout this presentation, we will therefore be engaging with these topics as intertwined and interconnected issues. To begin with some background on the scale of these issues, as all of you no doubt know, Vermont has experienced a worsening affordable housing crisis over the past years, with the share of current renters able to afford a median price Vermont home plummeting from 32% in 2021 to 6% in 2023. This is due to a number of factors, including the COVID pandemic, increased real estate values, and a 200% rise in migration to the state, to name a few. In response to this crisis, the state has set targets to develop 41,000 new homes by 2030 and 172,000 by 2050. And these targets are further subdivided by region and municipality. Meanwhile, the state has also lost more than 60% of its farmland since the late 1960s, and farm workers are one of the most housing insecure populations in the state. With this context, my colleagues will now present some local approaches for protecting ag land, building affordable housing, and balancing the needs for the two.
Thanks, Jen. I'm going to talk a little bit about Vermont. Much of this may be review or familiar. Act 250, our state level environmental review for proposed development and the current use program. We're going to talk specifically about the land use change tax part of the current use program because it's in the discussion. So a lot of what we'll talk about today will be building on these two. Alexis. Lately, as Jen mentioned, we've seen kind of some more work in addressing these in tandem. So Jen was talking about the housing targets required by the Home Act. The Home Act is also creating these Act 250 exemptions for affordable housing. So trying to find ways to balance the issues. In 2024, we had Act 181, starting this future land use mapping process, kind of run first by the regional planning commissions and then involving the town level planning commissions and then pulling in public input to try to plan what areas of our town we want to be kind of set aside for ag, set aside for different land uses, and what areas do we plan to keep developing? What are the future growth areas of town, essentially? And then allowing those towns to apply for Act 250 exemptions in those specific, they're not zoning districts, but they're similar to zoning districts. The Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, obviously not new, cornerstone institution that's been thinking about how to balance these two things for a while through the grant and loan programs for and the conservation easement funding mechanisms. And Jen talked about the challenge of farm worker housing in the state, and there's been increasing attention to that pinch. I know as someone applying to farm jobs this cycle, I hear that a lot from the farmers that I work with, that it's so hard to find staffing because they can't afford to live anywhere. But the Champlain Housing Trust has been working on this. There's loan programs for repair of farm worker housing, for development of new farm worker housing. That's kind of increasing. Next one. Big delay there. So 17% of our housing stock is in seasonal second homes. And that's another kind of point of dialogue lately. In about a third of towns, our primary residents, like primary home properties, are paying more property taxes than businesses and second homeowners, and it's flipped for the other 2/3. But second home buyers do pay a higher property transfer tax, several times higher in the state of Vermont at the point of purchase. So these two bills, of course, referred to the committee. The affordable housing exemption for current use change tax is dovetailing right in with Act 181, and that this creates land use change tax exemptions for those Act 181 planned growth areas, the areas towns say, hey, we want to grow here. And then Act 181 will create Act 250 exemptions for those same areas if the town chooses to apply. And so together, if this were to pass in a future session, it would really be like kind of opening up those areas about as much as I think is possible. And then House Bill 273, that kind of across the board reduction in the land use change tax is also recently proposed and didn't cross over. But if this were to pass, our group has been wondering about how it might interact with House Bill 134. Would it effectively reduce the kind of affordable housing bonus or the incentive for affordable housing that 134 is creating? An open question for possible discussion later. So I'm going to turn it over to Alexis to talk about what's going on in Maine.
Okay. Thank you. So a brief overview why we selected Maine as one of the additional states to kind of do a case study. It's really looking at similar demographics with Vermont, with being one of the most rural states in the US and also with an older population, to name a few. So first, we're to highlight from Maine what they're doing as far as agricultural land conservation. Similarly to Vermont, they do have a current use program that does is looking to conserve farmland. Under the program, there needs to be at least 5 contiguous acres of farmland and 2,000 annual agriculture sales to participate. And there is a penalty if the land is developed. At the municipal level, the state of Maine does have the voluntary municipal farm support program that enables municipalities to decrease property taxes to lower rates than the current use through temporary easements that can be up to 20 years. So as far as affordable housing goes, looking to also target rural areas, they have the Rural Affordable Housing Rental Program that incentivizes developers to create affordable housing by constructing 5 to 18 affordable housing units in a development. And this is specifically targeted to rural areas. So as far as second homes go, recently, Maine had a bill, HB 988, that was introduced in 2021 that was trying to propose have implementing an impact fee on vacant secondary residences. So the distribution of these fees, where this links to affordable housing, is they were looking to distribute the fees to the Housing Opportunities for Maine Fund for different affordable housing initiatives. The bill did not pass in 2022. The main reasons that were cited were the impact to vacation-owned homes owned by Maine residents, and also the violation of private property rights. So very much in Maine, looking at similar challenges of balancing farmland conservation with affordable housing and second homes. I will turn it over to Kevin to give us an overview of New York.
Thank you, Alexis. The second state that we wanted to highlight as a case study today is New York. Undoubtedly a much larger state than Vermont and more populous state, but one that is fairly agricultural. 20% of New York's land mass is in agriculture. And it has also, like Vermont, lost ag land at a faster rate than neighboring New England states. And as such, New York has been exploring ways in which to conserve ag land while also promoting affordable housing. The first program we want to highlight today is the Agricultural Assessment Program that New York has. It's similar to a current use program, but specific to ag lands. And as such, the eligibility criteria has been developed to work well with production farms. Of note, the agricultural assessment value that this program assigns to lands enrolled is based on soil class, promoting lands with ideal soils for agricultural production. The program also requires a higher gross agricultural revenue for lands enrolled at $10,000 annually. If land is over 7 acres, if land is under 7 acres, it must produce at least $50,000 to be enrolled in the program. The program also has a short period of time that land is enrolled for, 5 years rather than indefinitely. And there is a penalty for non-agricultural land conversion, but there's not a penalty if ag land enrolled is no longer actively farmed. So a farmer making a decision to not hay a field or not produce a crop on a land is not penalized for doing so. There are also 2 programs in New York that work with municipalities to promote agricultural land conservation. The first is the Agricultural Districts Program, which enables tax parcels to become agricultural districts, in which agriculture is the primary land use and active farm operations receive benefits for operating within them. The second program is the Farmland Protection Program, which establishes financial mechanisms to promote ag land conservation and agricultural protection planning efforts, both through different grant programs. Some grants promote and finance ag planning. Other grants support municipalities and counties in purchasing development rights and establishing ag easements. New York is also experiencing an affordable housing crisis. The state is estimated to need to build over 800,000 new homes over the next 10 years to meet its needs, and is taking steps to do that without impacting rural communities and agricultural lands. One way in which they're doing that is the New York Housing Compact, which is a comprehensive plan to promote infill development through rezoning and tax exemptions, effectively urbanizing more areas rather than sprawling into agricultural zones. And then at the same time, New York is investing more in their farm worker housing program. They currently offer $200,000 zero interest loans to farm operators to purchase and construct affordable housing for their staff. And then last but not least, New York is also considering how to handle second home ownership. There's a current bill that has been proposed, Assembly Bill A-1044, which proposes a progressive tax on second homes and condominiums that are not primary residences. That's being considered actively, though preceding versions of this bill have not been successfully passed, citing impacts to real estate values. So to wrap up our conversation, I think some areas to think about is the fact that all three states, Vermont, Maine, and New York, are addressing the interplay of agricultural land conservation and affordable housing, but doing so from unique perspectives that are built out of the needs and the characteristics of the states themselves. The current use programs differ throughout the states. Vermont and Maine have similar programs with different eligibility criteria. New York's is specifically agriculture, which is of note. Maine and New York also have unique programs that engage municipalities in conservation efforts, and all three states are addressing affordable housing using different financial mechanisms and planning mechanisms to try and balance the interplay between affordable housing and land conservation. And finally, Maine and New York have explored ways to disincentivize house ownership, but both have been unsuccessful in doing so. And that's all that we have.
Great, thank you. Representative Botham.
Yeah, one of the situations you mentioned was the possible billing of vacant second home owners. I think that was in Maine. How would that be determined? So does that mean like, oh, I have a second home and I come one weekend a month? Or is it like, oh, it's vacant for 10 months and you're there 2 months and then we build, like, how do you determine that?
Yes, thank you for the question. And to highlight, there is more information in the brief of the specific
I've
mechanisms.
got a paper on yours. Did you guys pass that out?
I think Dr. Niles didn't
Okay,
pass
all
it,
right, okay.
but I can briefly highlight what that mechanism looks like.
Okay.
So
Oh, it is this one. Okay, I'm sorry.
under that bill, how they define a vacant second home is a non-primary residence that has been vacant for 180 and it can be non-consecutive days during one calendar year. So that is how they are assessing, or under the proposed bill, how they would have assessed what is a vacant second home is, again, a home that fits that
So if you
definition.
don't live in it for at least half of the year.
Yeah, and they do stipulate that it's not, yeah, and that is tied into the definition of a non-primary residence,
Yeah.
which, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And New York is using that same 180 days in their proposed bill as well,
Which also hasn't passed.
which has not
Yes.
passed as well, yeah.
Representative Nelson.
Yeah, thank you. Do they take into account seasonal homes? Hunting camps, a camp on the lake that's not set up to live in the winter time may not have the septic structure to handle living in the winter time or year round.
So that was actually an issue that was highlighted of the reason why it wasn't passed. And what that looked like too is all Republican House members, plus I think it was 16 or 17 Democrats voted no on the bill. And this was a primary issue that was cited, is the impact on like like campgrounds or like, hunting, cottages that are actually owned by residents of Maine. So under that bill, it would be, to our understanding, possibly applicable to this impact fee. So that is an essential issue that was cited of why the bill wasn't passed.
Go ahead.
One other question on the Vermont Act 250 rule. Did you speak to that?
I did, yeah.
You did, right. Tier 1A, 1B lands.
Mhm.
I think being in Act 250, it removes the penalty of taking land it doesn't, as it stands, do anything with current use, but the prime agricultural fees, taxes are removed in tier 1A and 1B lands because of the removal of Act 250, am I correct?
So I'm not sure I can give you the right detailed answer to that question. What I know is right now we're in an interim, like an interim turnover moment from the old Act 250 way to the new Act 181 rules.
Yep.
And so this is where towns are deciding whether to apply for the 250 exemptions. And at the moment, the 250 exemptions are just active across the board. And then there's a deadline, I think it's next year sometime, when towns have to have applied, and either they'll keep the exemptions if they chose to apply for them, or the new review process with the new board will go into effect. But I could get back to you with a more detailed answer to that question.
Yeah, thank you. Great.
Representative Lipsky.
Thank you. You presented a statistic, I think it was 17% of Vermont's housing stock is owned by non-homesteaders.
Yep.
You should know that some of our communities, like mine, is 77% non-homesteaders. Ludlow may be 84, Dover may be 80. So the point, I'm really fascinated by these penalizing the vacant homes. We are in dire need of homesteaders, both as workforce, have children in school, engage in all aspects of community life and all over Vermont. So that's a big crisis pressure. What's my question? I am really fascinated by your allowing these other proposals that limit or penalize year-round homes, not hunting camps or that sort of thing, from being vacant, which would incentivize. Could they be long-term rentals, or any more information you have on that you want to share with this committee?
There's one thing that we didn't speak to in this, and I appreciate your question on that. It's something that I'm from the Northeast Kingdom, so I have some feelings about this. One thing that we didn't address is like that desire to bring more people into homestead, which is a whole other legislative issue. Obviously, it's beyond the scope of this particular presentation, but I know that Rural Vermont is doing some really interesting research and work on like how we can incentivize and make it easier, particularly for young people, to break into that market. Like, I mean, the housing market and the land prices in Vermont are absolutely astronomical right now. When you look at people who are struggling to just get by and pay rent, they're not going to be able to buy that land. So we end up with more of these second homes and fewer young people coming in and buying land. But if you haven't had a chance to engage with that, I would really encourage you to look into what Rural Vermont is doing with that project.
We have, and with VHCB, with land trust, and in this committee, we have focused a lot on access there are a lot of there's a waiting list of 890 some wannabe farmers, and can you lease to buy, and there are a lot of options that we're dialoguing about. So this committee is very tuned to those challenges. We know there's a pent-up demand, but the access and the funding and various programs there's some there, but it's just scratching the surface. Thank you.
I would say too, maybe to jump on that, one thing that came out in exploring the farmland protection program in New York is that there's been really effective through agricultural easements, lowering the barrier of entry for new farmers to get onto farmland and to ease that transfer of land between older farmers and newer farmers. And there's about 800,000 acres enrolled in that through that program to date. And they've seen it really support new farmers getting onto land because it's more affordable to do so.
I appreciate it.
Representative Burke.
Chair, are you possibly presenting to the environmental committee? Because I think that would be great. I think this because I mean, they're a big part of that conversation and to show like that, you know, what a great message of, you know, affordable housing and agricultural land or really any land in the state don't need to be juxtaposed against one another. We can work together, but I think there does need to be some needle moving of some sort in our current legislation in order to make that work. So it'd be great if you were able to connect with them, I think, as well.
Thank you, Representative. Maybe Dr. Niles, that's something we can talk about.
Approach out.
This is also recorded.
We are actually scheduled to take up a bill this afternoon that relates to the tax rate question on second homes. It's a large education bill, but we fund our education through property taxes the way that I'm sure Maine and New York do too, at least partly through property taxes. And one
We'll hear
thing.
about that in the next presentation.
Yeah, good, yeah. Yes, yeah. And one small but important piece of this bill does create a new category of property that would essentially be second homeowners that could be taxed at presumably at a higher rate. So, okay. Well, we should probably. Did you have a question, John?
Yeah, just a quick one, and it was follow up on what's been mentioned here is that when you looked at Maine and New York, one conversation we've had here, I'm very impressed with VHCB is this sort of idea of, I mean, farm fragmentation sounds awful, but it's actually like dividing up a farm into smaller farms because you can raise a lot of vegetables, for example, with 10 acres as opposed to say a 100-acre farm, and more young wannabe farmers can get on it then. And I didn't know if that conversation was coming up in New York and Maine, for example.
Yeah, I can speak from Maine. I think that is an issue that also Maine is looking at, you know, as we highlighted with like, you know, for example, the current use, they do stipulate that it's contiguous acres. So very much that is very present in Maine. And also in the brief too, the statistic is there with Maine, you know, having a severe decrease in farmland. So yeah, I can verify from a Maine state point of view, that is very much a concern and challenge that the state of Maine is looking at.
That was something that stood out to me in thinking about the agricultural assessment program in New York, in that as far as the land eligibility criteria, they do acknowledge that more farms are smaller and are still effective production farms. So to be enrolled in that program, initially it was 7 acres, grossing annually $10,000. But they have a stipulation where if you're under 7 acres, you can still enroll your land in that program if you're grossing over 50,000. And I think that aligns well with these smaller diversified vegetable farms that are becoming more familiar across the landscape. And so I think the program has been tailored to still support small new farms in receiving those tax benefits.
All right. Well, thank you again.
Thank you very much. Last one.
We're in front of
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm not right up on the nation board.
Oh, wow, yeah, really up there. I think I got my card this time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went up there with my cousin, took a 2013 Honda Fit manual.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, you get help. Thank you. I appreciate it.
So that's, those were my favorite pictures, honestly.
The pump sound out of it. Yeah.
All right, our last group we know is one that you have spent a lot of time focused on. And so we're very aware of all the testimony you've taken on the topic of universal school meals. The students have, in particular, a lot to share about what other states are doing in this way and how they fund those programs after a bit of a brief introduction on the program. And they'll tell you a bit about some of the research they did actually to understand some of the benefits and costs.
Great. I'll turn it over to you.
So yeah, hi, we're here to kick it off to talk about Vermont's Universal School Meal Programs. To start with some introductions, my name is Brian.
I'm Tori.
Kevin.
Said that.
And we just want to thank the committee for your time and attention. Today, we're going to talk about, Anna's going to start us off talking about the methods that we used to bring us through our fact-finding mission, but also to interview school nutrition professionals across Vermont.
Excuse me.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Then Tori is going to talk about some of the benefits seen not only by students, but also Vermont schools and families. Seth is going to continue talking about two scenarios about what will happen whether or not this program is repealed. Kevin's going to talk about the economic costs. And then before we conclude, I'll give an overview of a program comparison by different states, the 8 states that supply similar programs, and then go through the different funding mechanisms and revenue sources that each of those states utilizes.
So I'll just quickly go over kind of the methods that we use. So we all kind of came into this with different understandings and familiarity with the Universal School Meals program here. And so we started by reading the bill and spending a little bit more effort than I care to admit, going over the Vermont state budget and education funding. And then once we felt comfortable with that, we supported that with peer-reviewed literature from not the program here, but from similar programs across the United States. And reports from nonprofits like Hunger Free Vermont, who I know you have all heard from, testimonies to this committee, and other news articles and stuff around Vermont news sources. And then, so after doing all of that and kind of starting to compile our results, we realized we were kind of missing like the on the ground, like how this actually changed school behavior. So we decided to go to the experts in that field. So we talked to school nutrition coordinators across Vermont. It's a semester-long project. So ideally, we would have gotten more interviews. But we reached out to 12 school nutrition coordinators. Specifically, we tried to specifically hit your districts. And so we ended up getting 6 interviews about a half hour long in the 4 counties that have stars on them there. You can go to the next slide. And so the findings from these interviews, you'll see them throughout the rest of the presentation. Sorry, you can go ahead. Just get it out here. Okay, so the findings from these interviews will be throughout the presentation, and you'll see some quotes from them on the different slides, but I just want to quickly go over the key findings from the interview specifically. These are 5 things that I thought really stood out and that were consistent amongst the interviews. And so the first thing is everybody that we interviewed had overwhelming support of the program. When asked whether or not they wanted to continue it, they all said yes, and we asked them about benefits and drawbacks to the program, and they all kind of had trouble coming up with drawbacks. The second thing is that participation has increased across school districts. So that's something that all of them noted, and specifically having it increased with K-8 classrooms. And then another thing that they found was that we found through their interviews is that many of the students fell into what they called the middle, which is students that their families don't qualify for federal assistance, but they still don't have the financial capacity to meet their basic needs. And so these are kids that the school nutrition coordinators already had relationships with, and often were the ones that were in debt prior. And so they're the ones that many of them noted were benefiting the most from this program. And then fourth, just many of the benefits of the program that we'll go into after this are not really well quantified. And so something like participation, you can really easily say like participation increased by 20% in the school district, but something like student like feeling shame in the lunchroom or like the lunchroom atmosphere, it's a lot harder to say that increased by 10% or whatever. So a lot of that kind of can get lost when we're trying to compare how this program is impacting schools. And then the final point is something that I personally was really interested in, just how strict the nutrition guidelines are that these school professionals are really having to work within. And so something that I found through these interviews was that like, even if your family can bring you to school with a school lunch, they're not necessarily bringing that lunch with the same nutritional value that these professionals are able to do in the lunchroom.
So now going into some of the benefits specifically for students, this was compiled both through the interviews and then looking at research articles and other literature found online. So it was found to reduce cafeteria stigma and the shame that students, low-income students might feel from that qualify for free and reduced lunches. And it does this by creating a level playing field. So no student, a student in line doesn't have to worry about whether they can pay for the meal or not. They just go and get their meal and then they can go sit down. And then as Anna mentioned, it was also found to improve lunch participation. And the school climate was also found to be improved, which could be due to the reduced stigma. And then there was a study done through Vermont school staff that surveyed these staff and basically just that had the universal school meals, just getting their general opinions. And it was found that 60.5% of the Vermont school staff said that the community became more inclusive through the implementation of the universal school meals program. So looking at some benefits specifically for the schools, it allows schools to purchase more local food through programs like the Vermont Local Foods Incentive, which reimburses the schools for the local foods that they provide. And looking at that same study I just mentioned, it was found that 63.9% of Vermont school staff reported that their schools were better able to purchase local foods through this universal school meals. And then it also reduces school meal debt. So the schools aren't going to refuse kids meals, but they do track the debt that comes along with them not being able to pay for it. And looking at a district in Missouri, which implemented their version of the universal school meals program during the pandemic, but then removed it 2 years after, they saw that their meal debt increased fourfold when comparing the numbers to the beginning of the pandemic. And then I found a report from the School Nutrition Association that looked at the 2024 federal median unpaid school meal debt, which was found to be $6,900. So applying this to Vermont, which has 98 school districts, that total is approximately $676,200. And then it was also found to reduce burden on school staff and admin. Going back to the previous study, 82.8% of Vermont school staff reported reduced stress on their admin relating to family financing. And then finally, going into the benefits for Vermont families, it reduces the burden for low-income families. So the income eligibility for Vermont is 185% of the federal poverty line. Applying that to a single parent with 2 children, that income threshold is $34,645. So this, the universal school meals helps, as Anna mentions, the family might make more than that threshold, but still not enough to be completely food secure. So it helps, and then these families can use that money that they potentially have to pay for the school lunch to provide for other food, for other meals, to potentially become more food secure. And then the study that I keep mentioning, it was found that 97.7% of family financial stress was reduced through the universal school meals program.
So what happens if the universal school meals program is failed? Then each school district needs to decide if they want to go back to the pricing program or if they want to continue free meals for all the students. So based on these 2 scenarios, the lowest range of this cost would be if all go back to the pricing program, and the highest range would be if all keep the free meals for all the students. But in the reality, probably the cost would be somewhere in the middle of this spectrum. But now if we consider the first scenario, going back to the pricing program can increase the administrative costs estimated by USDA, which would be as high as $100,000 for each school. And also, as Tori mentioned, there would be the unpaid meal cost, which is unknown, but it is also funded by the education fund. And 48,000 students who won't be eligible anymore to receive
free meals would be impacted, and then which can lead to the loss of the other benefits that Tori mentioned. And on the other hand, if the schools want to keep the free meals for all the students, then it can different impacts. The overall cost would be the same as now, which is $18.5 million for the state. But currently, this cost is funded by different ways, including the homestead and non-homestead property taxes. But keeping the free meals can shift the cost from a categorical aid program to district's education spending. This can impact both the statewide non-homestead and local homestead property taxes. But in districts with higher education spending per pupil and based on their demographics, it can be higher for the homestead property taxes than other districts with lower education spending, which can have uneven distribution of the benefits throughout the state.
There's been a lot of numbers so far, and I've got just a couple more to talk about the costs that we're pretty much familiar with. But so in Vermont, I want to leave you with just a couple of cost figures. The first one is pure per pupil spending. In Vermont, one of the highest in the nation at $23,000 per pupil. Of that, the allotment for universal school meals is $346. The second one is when this legislation was enacted in 2023, Vermont appropriated not 29 million, and that number has grown in the last fiscal to about 31 million. We know that that's subsidized from the federal government, and the total bill for the Vermont taxpayer is $18.5 million. That's of the Vermont Education Fund, which is in the last fiscal was 2.55 billion. Which makes up less than 1% of the education fund.
So in terms of what other states are doing, there are currently 8 states in the union that offer some similar program related to universal school meals. They're all called something different, but they offer very similar benefits. So any combination of breakfast, lunch, summer meals, as well as snacks. So they have obviously different names, but they are similar programs. California and Maine actually led the way in enacting universal school meals in their states, but many states have followed suit. Now, all of these states receive federal funding through the National School Lunch Program, as well as the Community Eligibility Provision, Provision 2, and until recently, the Local Food for Schools Program through the USDA. Now, the majority of these pull from general education budgets to fund programs. The mechanisms differ by state, the name, as well as the source of revenue. Vermont, Minnesota, Maine, and California, as you know, in terms of Vermont, rely heavily on property taxes. Michigan, for example, receives 30% of district budgets from property taxes. California is individual in that it also pulls heavily from income taxes, but they do have a larger population with a higher median annual income than states like Vermont and Maine. So that may not be a viable solution here. Michigan and New Mexico actually favor a tax revenue base that relies heavily on income as well as sales tax. But 2 states actually offer unique solutions in terms of how they pay for universal school meals. So 6 of the states do just pull from a general education budget. But Massachusetts and Colorado are a little different. So Colorado actually has a income tax increase on earners making over $300,000 annually. That entirely funds their Healthy School Meals for All program. And Massachusetts, for the universal free school meals, has implemented what is commonly called a millionaire's tax. It's a 4% surtax on those individuals whose revenue exceeds $1 million annually. That actually, what that does is it supplements their fiscal budget. In 2023, it was around $1 billion. Over half of it, so $524 million, went to education initiatives, including the Universal Meals Program, as well as financial aid for college students.
And in terms of the millionaire's tax, something just a little anecdote, if that were to be enacted in Vermont, a similar tax, according to the 2023 Vermont personal income tax revenue, we would receive around $108.7 million. So just a little fun fact.
Awesome. So I just kind of want to wrap up here just by reiterating many of the benefits that Tori was able to share that we found in the interviews and through the literature review. There were more that we found, but we know that you have already heard a lot about this. So if you're interested, you can ask us afterwards. But yeah, the benefits are really to students, they're to families, they're to schools. But we also recognize that there is this financial concern of the program. And in a world where, you know, the federal financing of these kinds of programs is a little bit more uncertain. It's really important to like figure out how we can be funding a program like this in the most sustainable way so that it can stay toward the future. And so hopefully comparing this to other states has been helpful in understanding like what other mechanisms can exist here. And yeah, while it's not simply a budgetary issue, I think, you know, the budget is a little complex. It's good to know like where other places are pulling it from. And yeah, I guess we just want to thank you for all the time that you've already put into this, and hopefully this presentation will be able to help you as the Universal School Meals program continues around the State House.
Great. You've clearly done a deep dive. So I will just say before we take questions, before we started the second half, I said it was gonna be difficult to match the quality and level of material in your presentations to what we've seen in the first half. You clearly all did that, so thank you. Representative Nelson.
Thank you, Chairman. And can we hire these people to do deep dive for us? What we got, Bill? You know, Universal School Meals, you heard it here first, right in this room, that we're going to support it. And it was across the board, a nonpartisan issue. We all voted for it. The increase from pre-pandemic to now because of the way we count our students' poverty level. We went from 34% roughly somewhere in there pre-pandemic. And now we're at 60% level. So 60% of the students in the state would be covered for free and reduced. Enabling us to, hopefully it stays in place. Like $34.5 million of federal dollar, almost getting a 2-to-1 return on your 18.5 towards this. So, you know, I saw somewhere that you had a cost to per school district or to supervisory unions, of which is 52 of $100,000. Am I right?
Yes, $100,000 for each.
Under each school or?
Each.
It's estimated from
USDA.
USDA.
So you take that account and you add it back in with the loss of people enrolling their children, we're gonna be way more than the $18.5 million. So it's a win-win all the way around, and we feed kids without fear of stigma, and they all have parity. They can all eat lunch together and be kids. Good stuff, thank you.
Beer.
Sorry, there wasn't a question. Sorry, there wasn't a question in there.
No, I appreciate it.
Very
Yeah.
That was an easy one.
Yeah, we have that rule that at the very end, you should just say, right? Then it becomes a question. I read an article 2 or 3 days ago. I think it was in the New York Times. It was in national media talking about talking about universal school meals. And it was clear that the journalist didn't know as much as you all know.
Yeah.
It suggested that states like Vermont, California, those that have adopted a statewide program are funding it entirely on their own, which we know that they're not, that the federal government still pays for students who qualify, who meet the guidelines. And then in addition, if you have a meals program, a universal program, that they chip in a little bit more, which we have fully taken advantage of. And the legislation that we passed, I know Hunger Free Vermont anyway has told us that that's model legislation, and other states have used it. And maybe you heard that from them as well. But it does raise concerns, though, and you mentioned a couple times that the local food for schools program, which has been cut maybe permanently. The other program that somebody else mentioned in an earlier study, the LFPA program, also cut. We still do rely on federal funding for our meals programs, and we're keeping an eye on that. Fingers crossed. Representative O'Brien.
One thing I'd love to, since you guys know so much about it, would be interesting to come up with some comparables on like the data you had on how much is spent per student in the state and how much universal school meals cost, because the wonder is that it took us so long to get to universal school meals when there's so much that's universal already in our schools. So it'd be interesting to say, like, how much are we spending on transportation per student, or on sports or textbooks? Because I think in that context, you're like, wow, this is actually the best deal for Vermont students, and it's nutrition, which is vital.
And I think that's really important to put it into context, because obviously this isn't simply a budgetary issue, but $18.5 million is a lot of money. So naturally somebody might want to cut it or reduce it or somehow figure out a different way to budget it. We calculated it the other day. If it were per student per day, universal school meals is around, I want to say $1.75 per student per day.
For breakfast and lunch.
For breakfast and lunch and any other like subsequent, like snacks, things like that. I wish I could feed myself that and with that. So
Absolutely.
The data that you're looking for, the through people, it's broken down. I have it. You mustn't include it. But yeah.
It would have been a long presentation.
Representative Lipsky.
I apologize for missing 30% of your presentation. My question is, did you address the positive impacts on learning outcomes? If you put a value on that in your presentation.
So we didn't talk about it in the presentation. It has been, and maybe Tori can speak more on it. It is in the literature a little bit, but it is kind of what I was saying, where it's kind of hard to quantify that, especially in the short time span that universal school meals has been implemented, where researchers have 4 years of data to talk about it. So it's kind of hard to talk about like graduation rates or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want
And in Vermont, it's very recent. So there's only a couple of like academic papers that really touch universal school meals in Vermont.
Anecdotally, in the past couple of years, we've received testimony by educators and administrators. Because of the pandemic, it was policy, and across the board, they said there was notable positive attention span, engagement outcomes were.
I found studies that like surveyed like people in Vermont, and it was found there, but I couldn't find any with like strict numbers on like how much had been increased like through test scores or graduation rates. And I think that literature is still to come, because through like longitudinal studies, it takes longer time.
Yeah, I'm curious. I don't know if you'll have an answer to this or if you have time to look into it, but I mean, one of the things that's challenging for us here in Vermont is that I think it's fair to say that both the House and the Senate, we had very strong support for this when it was passed initially, and now when we've been looking at it again. But our governor left it out of his budget. We passed policy and the governor didn't put it in his budget. So in order to fund it, it made our appropriations committee have to do some serious work juggling other things because it was left out. I'm wondering, in these other states, have you also noticed that sort of different branches of government supporting and then sort of jeopardizing it by not following through? Or have you found more support once it's passed in other states?
Yeah, so that is actually something I was hoping you would ask because I did want to talk about it, but it didn't really fit into the
Awesome.
overview, so thank you.
Okay,
Vermont's actually not alone in having these programs in jeopardy.
yeah,
Minnesota, their free school meals for kids program is actually under scrutiny due to the cost.
Yeah.
And it may face cuts as the state seeks to reduce their budget.
Yeah.
Colorado has their healthy school meals for all, and they're the state that has that. If you make over $300,000 annually, there's a flat
Yeah.
percentage tax on that.
Yeah.
But it's more expensive than it was originally projected. So the entire program is actually currently underfunded, excuse me. So the state education fund is stating a deficit. So they're sort of scrambling as well.
yeah, okay, all right, thank you.
Right, well, one more round of applause for everybody. Dr. Niles, I know you did say that you were noting questions, so however, we could talk about how you'd like to share that information with us, I don't know, individually or maybe as a group. As a group probably would be.
Sure, yeah, I think what we'll do is I'll debrief the students next week in class, and I've made note of some of the follow-ups. If there's additional follow-ups as you're bubbling up, or even like this afternoon, it sounds like talking about a very relevant piece of legislation and something else comes up, feel free to send that to me. And then we can do a little sort of post-committee debrief and a little deeper dive digging on a few of these issues as well.
Great. Are you planning to stay, or do you need to get back to wherever you're?
Well, I can stay. You want me to hang out?
More than welcome.
The students are in varying vehicles. Secretary Kevitz did take this half of the students down to meet with the Senate Ag Committee this morning. And got a little tour. And then I just heard actually from Carrie Stoller at the Patsy Bank. She took the other students down to meet the Senate Ag Committee and do a little tour. So I think they've all had a nice little look around.
Well, I was just gonna say, if you're here, I wasn't sure whether you were planning to stay, have lunch and then stay at all in the afternoon, but at 1 o'clock, we'll be on the House floor. And if you haven't seen that, it's just interesting to.
Yes, check it out.
If you're in the balcony, maybe the chairman would get up and
We can introduce you if anybody's